We have Alex from Squarespace. Welcome, Alex.
Clicker is not working. There we go. So a thing I didn't realize until I started doing some research for this talk is just how old the concept of service level agreements actually are. It wasn't necessarily surprising to find out that telcos have been using this language back into the 80s and even the 70s for their contracts with customers. But it was a little more surprising to find that banks were also using the term service level agreements going back as far as the 1970s. And I even found a UN document dated from 1948 that used the term. And we can even go back further than that. I found a job posting for a punch card machine operator in Boston in 1926 that used the term service level agreement. And if we think about it, we can probably go even further back than that. As long as humans have been exchanging money for some kind of service, there's likely been some kind of expectation for what that service should look like. But look, overall, I'm not a historian. I'm a site reliability engineer. My name is Alex Hidalgo, and I think reliability is very important. In recent years, it seems like people are talking about SLOs and SLAs and SLIs constantly. And in fact, this is some data from Google's Ngram project, which has scoured books and magazines and newspapers over the course of centuries to find out how often certain phrases and certain terms have been used. And you'll see as time goes on, the use of some of these phrases, like service level agreements, has spiked way up. And this data actually is only from 1970 to 2008, because that's all the data the Google Ngram project was ever able to ingest. So while we see the spike in this curve, I have a feeling in recent years it's spiked up even further. And why is that? Why is everyone suddenly talking about service level agreements and service level objectives? I think the answer is actually pretty simple, because there's so many services now, right? Everything is a service. You have platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, and monitoring as a service, and network as a service, database as a service, and none of those even capture the most common one, SaaS, which alone SaaS can stand for software as a service, or security as a service, or search as a service, or storage as a service, right? There are so many services, and even if you're not totally in the cloud and you're not outsourcing everything, you probably have a microservice architecture, right? Which is services talking to other services that depend on other services, right? It's services all the way down. And so with everything being a service now, we need to think about reliability of these services in a different way than we may have in the past. Today, we've heard many excellent talks about tracing and metrics and logging and analysis of these things, and insight into your processes. And that's all awesome. These are all great talks, and that's where my passion lies. But we can also talk about what can we actually do with all that data. So I present to you what I call the service reliability stack. At the bottom, we have service level indicators, or SLIs. An SLI is just a metric that tells you, is the service doing what it's supposed to be doing? This is often a ratio of good events over total events. Right? The best SLI is either true or false. Either your service is doing what it's supposed to, or your service is not doing what it's supposed to. And that's what reliability really is, right? When I say reliability, people often go to availability or uptime or error rates, but none of that matters. Reliable means, is it doing what your users need it to do? Next, we have SLOs, or service level objectives, which are informed by SLIs. And an SLO is just a target. Right? So if an SLI is true or false, and therefore provides you a ratio, good events over total events, an SLO is just the target for what you want that ratio to hopefully be. The other thing that SLOs let you do is, well, just not aim for 100%. Nothing is reliable all the time. That is simply true, right? Engineers outside of software have known this for a very long time. Everything's going to fail at some point in time. That's simply how it is. And that's fine. Your users probably don't care. Right? Every once in a while, something isn't going to work perfectly, as long as it's working often enough. So an SLO lets you choose a good target for how often that should be, instead of striving for 100. And finally, at the top of the stack, we have error budgets. And an error budget is really just an indication of how your SLO has done over time. How has it performed? Because it's one thing to be able to say, are we currently meeting our SLO? Are we currently meeting our SLO? Are we currently meeting our SLO? It's a whole separate thing to have a more holistic view, which says, how has our SLO performed over the last week, the last month, the last quarter, the last year? The other thing that error budgets give you is just a more human understandable way to talk about some of these numbers. It's one thing to say, my service is going to be reliable 99.9% of the time. What does that even mean? Well, using error budgets, you can say something along the lines of 99.9% is also kind of saying we cannot be operating correctly for about 43 minutes every 30 days. Now, we started off the talk talking about service level agreements, and they're really just like SLOs. They're generally a little stricter. And the other big difference is generally there's a contract involved, right? Generally, you violate your SLA, and it means you owe someone money or a credit or something like that. SLAs are generally informed by the same SLIs, and they have their own error budgets that can drive decisions and all that kind of stuff. But let's stop talking about this, because what I want to talk about today is SLIs, service level indicators, because they're at the base of this stack. And if you don't have them, everything's going to come crashing down and potentially catch on fire. So why do I think SLIs are so important? A few reasons. As I hope to show in this talk, you can end up with happier users. Side note, what do I mean when I say user? What I really mean is anything that interacts with your service. It doesn't have to be a human, right? It can be another service, it can be a robot. It's anything that relies on your service. So good SLIs, meaningful SLIs, should hopefully get you happier users, happier engineers, and happier product teams. This is because SLIs measure the reliability of your service. As I stated earlier, your service only has one job. It needs to do what the users of the service need it to do, right? I don't care if you have no errors in your logs and your metrics say everything's fine, and when you check Cube, it tells you that you have 13 replicas running and they're not crash looping, and none of that matters if your service isn't doing what it's supposed to. And this means that users define your reliability, not you. And that's all a good SLI is. It's a metric that thinks about your service from your user's perspective. So let's talk through a little example about what this might actually look like. So here we have a web API server. It doesn't matter what it does. It's some kind of request and response, right? Users send it a request, it does something, and sends some data back. So what are some things we might care about? Well, we probably care, is the service up? It's not a bad place to start. So we go back, and here we have our user, and our user is wondering, is the service up? And it is. The service is running, except the user can't reach it. All right, so go back to our list of things we care about. Is the service available? Because that's totally different than just being up. So we go back to our user, and the user is now asking, is the service available to me? And it is. Awesome. The user is happy until they realize that it's incredibly slow. So now we care about, is the service up? Is it available? Is it responsive? The user goes back and checks again. Is the service responsive? And yes, the service is responding so quickly, unbelievably quickly. Everything's great, except it's only returning errors. So we go back to our list of things we care about again, right? Now we need to know, is it up? Is it available? Is it responsive? Are the responses good? Our user checks again, and it's awesome. We're not just getting errors. We're getting 200s. Everything's great, except the data format is incorrect. All right, so we go back to our list a fifth time. Now we care, is the service up? Is it available? Is it responsive? Are the responses good? And is the data format correct? If you're expecting JSON, you better not get a binary blob, right? So the user asks again, and this time the service responds, and it's in the correct format. Awesome. Oh, but it's yesterday's data. All right, so we have to add one more thing. Is the data fresh, right? And we could do this all day. We could come up with many more than 6 things. But the point is, you need to think about all of this. Availability doesn't matter. Error rate doesn't matter, right? You need to make sure that the service is doing what your users actually need it to do. So now we have this long list of things, all the things that we need to care about, because these are the things our users care about. And it's just so much stuff. So now we have a new problem. There are so many things to care about. If only we could measure many things by measuring only a few. But this problem has a solution, because you can measure many things by only measuring a few. So as an example of this, let's go back to our list of things we care about, and let's start at the bottom here, right? If you can determine that you're getting fresh data, that means you know that the data format's correct, and that means you know you're not sending only errors back, and that means you know that the service is both available and up. And now I may concede maybe you have to measure responsiveness, latency in a slightly different way, but even if you do, that still means you only have to measure 2 things to capture all 6 of these. And this is what an SLI is, right? An SLI that we could develop for this web API we've been talking about might read something like, requests to our API will result in responses that provide fresh data to clients within 200 milliseconds, right? And here's how we do the math. We now have a number of requests to our API that result in responses, good stuff, all over total requests, and that equals a percentage. So, but now you may be saying, okay, that's fine, but my service is a lot more complex than a single request and response API. So it's fine. Let's apply these same principles to something a little more complicated. Let's say you run an online retail website. Oh, sorry. The point of all this is that, as I told you earlier, that users, engineers, and product teams should all be happier. And that's because SLIs focus on users' needs. Engineers will end up getting fewer pages because you only have to page if you are not doing what your users need it to do. And product teams are happier because you're actually measuring what the product is supposed to do. Okay, so now you're saying, but my service is much more complicated. So let's go through that example. So you have a retail website, and so you have some kind of web app running out there, and it's probably distributed. And that means we need a load balancer in front of it. And there's probably some microservices, like you need something to figure out whether or not people can log in, and you probably need a payment gateway microservice, and there's probably a database in there somewhere, and there's probably a shopping cart to keep track of what people want to buy. And then we've got to add a cloud over here because that represents the internet. And we have this little diagram. And what are some things that we may care about? What are some things users may care about? And I think one of the first things is, can they log in if they have an account? So let's look at what the login process might look like. How could we measure that? I mean, you could look at the web app talking to the login microservice, and that's not bad because that will tell you whether or not there's any errors in between the login microservice and the database. So you're measuring a few things at once. But what it doesn't tell you is the traffic even being routed through the load balancers and reaching the web apps in the first place? What you really need to look at is the entire user journey, all of it. So you need to know, can a user from outside of our network get their traffic routed across the internet, load balanced correctly to one of our distributed web apps? Can it then talk to the login microservice? And when it sends the credentials to the database, can it verify that everything's fine? And then can it send this data back? And can the web app generate a page that shows that they're logged in and send it back across the load balancers and back across the internet, all the way to the user's browser? That's what we really need to care about here. So an SLI for this more complicated service might read something like, when clients external to our network provide a username password combination, the page reloads in a logged in state. And that's not the only thing we have to care about, though, right? There's a bunch of SLIs here. We need to know, does the payment gateway work correctly? And does the shopping cart work? Is it consistent? If you add things in it, do they stay there? Do they not just drop out? This is because meaningful SLIs are developed by caring what your users care about, right? Not necessarily what you think they should care about. So here's a quick list, right? Just some things that you should care about, things you should measure, and things that should be SLIs. Can the user log in? That's good. Can the user buy something? That's good. Does search work? Is the shopping cart consistent? Stuff you shouldn't care about, API uptime, error rates, database query latency. I'm not saying you shouldn't measure these things. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't fix them if things are bad. But they shouldn't be your primary focus. And they definitely shouldn't be a service level indicator. So by developing meaningful SLIs, you'll end up with happier users, happy engineers, happy product teams, and hopefully a happier you. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Questions for Alex? This is a great topic. Don't waste the opportunity. Okay, here's one.
Well, it's kind of the unstructured question is how do you even figure out what your users care about? I mean, there's several dimensions on which you could think about. So what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So the question is basically how do you figure out what your users do care about? And there's a few different ways here, right? One, you can just try to put yourself in their shoes. That's a good first step, right? Think about if I was using my service, what would I want it to do, right? Like that's a good first step. But often if you have a product team, that's a great place to start. Product managers often have documents literally titled user journeys, right? And those user journeys are a great starting point. Those are probably your service level indicators, right? And they're not always easy to measure, right? This often involves writing new code and putting up black box probers and all that, right? I get it. It's not necessarily trivial. But the closer you can get to your user's perspective, the better things can be. The other thing I'll say is that interviews are great, not surveys. Surveys are generally don't have a great fidelity. People don't care about them. They'll skip right over them. They'll just select a bunch of like 1 or 5 or 1 or 5, and they'll often skip the free-form text box thing. So if you can conduct interviews, either internally if your users are internal, or even external if your users are external, and especially if it's a time-sensitive thing, compensate them in some way for that as well. Interviews are one of the absolute best ways to truly understand how is our service working for you right now, and what would you need us to do to change it to make it better? And that's another great way to find out what you should be measuring.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Question over here in the corner.
Hi, thanks. Could you give us an example of some of the most surprising from the engineering team's perspective SLIs that you've come across?
So just wondering about SLIs that seem kind of unique and different.
That really surprised you from the engineering team perspective. You thought, well, this is something that we
Gotcha. Yeah, so the question is, have you ever ran across SLIs that seemed surprising to you? I think a good example of that is that so currently at Squarespace, I manage the Elk stack, so our entire log ingestion pipeline and all that kind of stuff. And we thought we were doing pretty good at ingesting things within like 5 minutes or so, right? And that's what we chose. And it turns out when we actually went to users, they're like, we need our logs like within like a minute, man. Like we need them in like 2 minutes. And people were actually very upset with us, and we didn't realize it, right? We knew stuff wasn't good. We knew we weren't as reliable as we wanted to be, but it wasn't a priority for us because we hadn't taken the time to go reach out to people. And they'd kind of developed a fatigue, right? They just expected Elk at Squarespace doesn't run as well as it should. And no one was telling us anymore. No one was complaining anymore, right? So that's one example of just something like we thought we were measuring things okay. We thought we had insight into our stack. Turns out, because we weren't measuring end-to-end latency, right? We were watching, is Kafka cool? Is Logstash cool? Is Elasticsearch cool? And that's all fine, but the total end-to-end latency was bad, and we didn't know that until we went and talked to our actual customers and talked to our actual users.
Thanks. Is that a question in the middle? Yeah, right here.
You stopped with the correctness of the data with, is the data fresh?
Sure.
But where do you draw the line between an SLI and just a plain system requirement as you talk about the correctness?
Yeah, so I think a thing to point out is that this isn't a thing you do, right? SLIs and SLOs are not a thing you can like check the box. You know, it can be done. It's something that constantly evolves, and you're not going to be able to get all the way to what it actually looks like for your users, right? Unless you're hiring a whole ton of humans to sit there and constantly actually interact with your service, you can't get to that kind of fidelity. And that's fine. The idea is just to get as close as possible. So where to draw the line? I think it's up to you, your team, and your resources. And at the end of the day, it's are your users happy, right? If you're measuring things well enough that users of your service are happy with how reliable it is, then maybe you don't have to measure it any better than that. The focal point of SLOs and SLIs, and the reason why they're different from service level agreements, right? Because service level agreements imply some kind of contract, and that means you can't change them, right? You've told a customer, you're paying us X amount of money for this year, and that means we're going to be available 99.99% of the time, blah, blah, blah. But a service level objective, you can change it whenever you want. And you can change your SLIs whenever you want. And you can improve on them, or you can degrade them if you need to. Maybe you find out you actually don't have to be as reliable as you thought you had to be, right? So I guess, slightly meandering way to say, it depends. You can draw your own lines. There's no rule here, right? There's no hard line. There's no you are now doing SLIs, right? It's just a different way of thinking about your service. Am I thinking about it from my user's perspective? Am I measuring things from my user's perspective? Or at least as close as I can reasonably get.
Thanks, Alex. Time for one more question. I see. Sorry, we're going to go to the opposite side.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question about, or your thoughts on data correctness rather than freshness, and what are your thoughts on putting SLIs on top of whether or not the data itself is correct?
Yeah, 100%. It's a short talk, and it's supposed to be fun, right? And it's not supposed to get too in-depth, right? I run 4-hour workshops at Squarespace where we really get into all this, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. Data correctness is another thing that you should absolutely consider talking about. I guess my point is just I only had room for so much. And that part, I think, is fun, but once you get past 6, maybe it would have just gotten kind of tired, right? So, yeah, it's simply if that is important to your users, which data correctness almost certainly is, yeah, absolutely. That is what you should be measuring.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Thank you.